Okie dokie. I'm going to share this out, I believe. Okay, let's see. 1 second. Just setting up this. Pardon for all those who are okay, it's watching at the moment. Second. I'm just setting things up. Just going to share quickly, so pardon for everyone for just waiting. Here is the stream. Okay, I think we are almost ready to go. Pardon for those who have just joined the stream. My name is Anthony Avice Du Buisson. I'm an essayist. I'm South African born. I live currently in Australia. I currently study a Bachelor of Arts with a major in Politics and International Relations and a Bachelor of Laws. My interests are in the Middle East, especially minority rights, and as well as geopolitics and foreign policy. For all those of you who don't know me, I usually contribute to a number of online syndications such as The Region, Areo Magazine, and Jerusalem Post. I am a freelance writer. That's how I would describe myself. My writing mostly centers on the Middle East, specifically on Kurdish issues such as Kurdish human rights in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and of course Turkey, otherwise known as Bashur, Rojava, Rojhelet, and Bakur. I started writing when I was about 16. I started writing in 2013 for a Facebook page called Philosophy, the Stuff of Magic. At the time, I was exploring my writing abilities, notably testing out how to write at the time, because my English was very basic back then. I used to write on philosophy, mostly on Stoicism and existentialism, as well as ancient Greek philosophy. I wrote for the page for a number of years. I started sharing within Facebook groups, mostly intellectual discussion type groups, or what they would call intellectual discussion groups. Not really, that's what the names were. But other than that, I started writing for the first, I guess, online syndication I started writing for was The Region. And actually not The Region, it was Areo Magazine. For those of you who do not know what Areo Magazine is, it's a magazine dedicated to free thought as well as a number of intellectual topics. They mostly focus on, nowadays we would call it the intellectual dark web, but back then it was mostly people writing about issues to do with science, philosophy, as well as identity politics and other such topics. One of the topics that I wrote for Areo Magazine was, of course, Stop Enslaving Saudi Women. Now, this was a sort of like a test for me, a test for me into political writing, because prior to that, I used to write, as I mentioned, philosophy. And I had tested somewhat into the realm of politics with an earlier piece, just a couple months earlier in July, just when the failed coup happened in Turkey, on the rise of Erdogan and the tyranny of Erdogan's Republic of Fear, as I titled my essay. For all of those of you who have just joined us, sorry again for those who have already been joining us. I just wanted to mention that I was just setting up the stream as an introduction to myself, so please be free to chat in the live chat. I haven't done a stream for quite some time. I've been doing it in other, I think other channels. I've been on Superpower Broadcasting with Kevin Castley. I've also been on Reese's Nightmare Fuel podcast as well. I've been on Tibbs or Progressive Warhawks podcast as well, mostly to talk about Syria. So today I thought I would just introduce people to who I am and what I do. So for all of those of you watching, thank you for taking the time out to listen to me. And I think this should be going for about 2 hours. But back to what I'm talking about. For those of you who have just joined the stream, my name is Anthony Avice Du Buisson. I am South African born and I currently live in Australia. I'm an essayist. I write on a number of different topics such as philosophy, politics, history, and foreign policy, as well as minority rights. My area of focus is the MENA region, or the Middle East and North African region. I focus specifically on Kurdish issues. I have been focusing on that for the last couple years. However, I have also written on Saudi women's rights and also the rights of Turkish people against their current tyrannical government. I started writing for Philosophy, the Stuff of Magic back in 2013 when I was 16 years old. I initially wrote on philosophy, mostly ancient Greek philosophy, and I shared those pieces in intellectual discussion groups, or what they were called intellectual discussion groups on Facebook, with mostly a couple thousand people really who were, you could say, flirting with the idea of like philosophy or science or history. Some of it was engaging, other times it was a bit brain dead, and I don't mean to sound a bit pretentious with that, but honestly, when you see some of the threads and some of the replies to the original post, you will kind of lose your faith in humanity a bit. But regardless, I posted there. It was somewhere to start. My writing was not really that good back then. My grammar especially was not good, because at that time I really used writing as a vehicle to help me develop my own writing skills. So I had to develop my punctuation, grammar, and I used philosophy or the topic of philosophy as a vehicle to improve that writing. And I must say that it did help me gather the necessary skills to jump into what I would later do, which is, of course, politics. I made a website called philosophyismagic.com, which has been recently reformed and refined a bit, which has a new website, as you can see in the description box below. But that's what I have been uploading since probably 2014. I shifted slowly into politics with one of my first political writing pieces on President Erdogan and the failed coup in Turkey, as well as the consolidation of power by Erdogan's AKP regime. I wrote essentially that Erdogan was creating a republic of fear in Turkey. That was my main argument. That can be found on my website, although I have to re-upload it. But it did introduce me into that political environment. And I did make a video on this channel as well that you'll be able to see. If you just go search in my videos, you'll be able to see. For those of you who are curious, the photos on the screen are actually by a number of photographers. Some of them are Rodi Sayed, who's a Kurdish photographer that's currently in the northeast of Syria, or Rojava, as the Kurds call it, or Western Kurdistan, Rojava Kurdistani. So these photos that are currently being shown in the slideshow come from primarily him, as well as a number of other photographers as well from Iraq and Iran as well. So enjoy those photos. Just going to see if many more people join. But as I was saying, when it came to writing, for me, shifting from philosophy to politics was a bit of a hard leap. For it's easy, if you're writing on subjects such as philosophy, it's quite easy to, how can I say, engage with the subject matter, because you can sit it from an armchair perspective. It doesn't take much of a current political lens to analyze such topics, because they've already been analyzed by countless academics, historians, and philosophers alike since they were published all those hundreds to thousands of years ago. But when it comes to politics, as my mentor told me, a man by the name of Rainer Jacob, He was he is actually still alive. I shouldn't say he was. He is a German artist. He's very, I would call him an expressionist. His art is amazing. He's done some artworks pieces for me as well when I used to write some poetry and some short stories, although I must be honest, they are not my forte. I found myself much more versed in philosophy and politics. Now, when it comes to my political shift, I started writing for Areo Magazine, and for those of you who don't know what Areo Magazine is, it is a online syndication. It mostly publishes pieces on science, philosophy, and intellectual discussions around those areas, as well as identity politics and criticism of identity politics. I'll call it a centrist magazine. I wrote a piece for that magazine in late 2016 called A Kingdom of Tears, where I wrote on the Stop Enslaving Saudi Women movement. It's for those of you who don't know about that movement, it was a movement, well, it's still going on, I guess, but it's sort of lost steam. It was started in 2016 for the express purpose of ending the male guardianship system in Saudi Arabia. It took the form through a social media campaign on Twitter with the hashtag Stop Enslaving Saudi Women. And I wrote an article about the history of Saudi Arabia, from the founding of the kingdom all the way to its current political environment, as well as its current challenges. That piece is a bit old now. A lot of things have changed since then. I should actually update it. Some things that have changed, of course, is that women have been allowed to drive. There's also been a lifting of restrictions on the ability of women to travel, although they are not huge, I guess, lifting of restrictions. Yeah, as I've just checked the chat now, by the way. Hello, Mr. Kitone Kun. Sorry for not getting to your responses earlier. Just been trying to, because as I said before, this is a very new, well, it's not new, I've already done it before on other channels, but for me, it was a bit interesting to try to get the setup, so I appreciate those who are watching. So, I agree, intellectual discussion groups aren't that intellectual. Just started posting again after some years on a group you're still a mod on. This says top mod due to alphabetical listening. Amazing how many of these stories have totally fallen out of memory. It's actually kind of it's a bit unfortunate that some of these groups aren't as, I guess, skeptical as they claim to be. There's more of it's almost like a title to be called skeptic. But I just wanted to sort of get to just some of your comments. I'll respond to more of them later. I should actually get on with the stream, as you mentioned. But anyway, so I started actually writing on Stop Enslaving Saudi Women's Rights movement. That piece explored the history of the Saudi kingdom, from the origins in the 1930s all the way to its current political dynamics. Things have changed, of course, but it still is quite relevant. After that Stop Enslaving Saudi Women's Rights piece, I had been originally focused on the Kurds for quite some time prior to that. It starts out its own story, but if I had to place a start for it, I would have to say that my interest in the Kurds started really in 2013 with a man by the name of Christopher Hitchens. I'm sure that everyone who will later listen to this will be familiar with that name. Christopher Hitchens being, of course, a journalist, a polemicist, and a avid political commentator, and overall, I would say, intellectual heavyweight. He actually inspired me to write back in 2013 because I actually read his last book. And I discussed this on Jay Turner's The War Kettle podcast, so if you want to look that up, you can actually look for the full discussion on this. I don't want to start being in that, but one of the things that he wrote on was the Kurds. For those of you who don't know, Christopher Hitchens actually changed his political views on war and humanitarianism in the early to mid 90s. And it's just because of, well, I shouldn't say it was just because, it was primarily because of his adventure to Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurdistan regional government. He wrote a piece called The Struggle of the Kurds for National Geographic. I believe it's either the 1991 or 1993 issue of National Geographic magazine. You'll have to look that up. It's also available in his Love, Poverty and War anthology. It's a very interesting book, and I really recommend people actually pick that up to have an idea at least of his views on the Kurds. And he sort of introduced me to the Kurdish people, and ever since 2013 I started watching the events in places such as the north of Syria, or otherwise known as Rojava Kurdistan, which is Western Kurdistan. There, for all of you who do not know, there's a small movement that has been going on there since 2012. It's the Rojava Revolution. It's a democratic confederalist movement. So you could say we called it left-wing social libertarian-esque movement. And this movement has been going on since 2012, mostly for rights for Kurds and other ethnic minorities in the northeast from the Assad regime. I started watching the rise of this small movement since 2013, and that really got me into writing about, or at least focusing on, the Kurds. I remember very vividly watching the Siege of Kobani in 2014, when Daesh sieged that northern city in Rojava. It's basically just north, I would say, of the Euphrates River, northeast of the Euphrates River. It was sieged by Daesh, and the YPG, as well as the YPG and Peshmerga, defended, or we could just call them Kurdish forces, defended that area against Daesh's onslaught. It was a turning point for me, it showed me the power, I guess, of the Kurds, and also reminded me of a lot of what Hitch had been saying about the Kurds, not only in 1991, 1993, but also during the Iraq War days, about the Kurdish parties in, you could say, Iraqi Kurdistan, or Bachelor of Kurdistan, southern Kurdistan. That's what got me really interested in minority rights, as well as Kurdish issues, which I have been following for those of you who don't actually follow me on Twitter. My Twitter is at Stoic Viper, capital S, lowercase TOIC, capital V, lowercase IPER. Those are that's what my Twitter handle is. I've been writing on the Kurds since 2016 officially, but I've been following them since, as I mentioned, 2013. For Areo Magazine, I released another piece in July of 2017, on the Yazidis, which are an ethnic Kurdish minority in, of course, southern Kurdistan, who were genocided by Daesh during August of 2014 onwards, where thousands of Yazidis were slaughtered under a fatwa by Daesh, and those who were not slaughtered were either brutalized or enslaved. Some of them are still being found today, after all these years, still trying to be liberated by Kurdish forces and Iraqi forces alike. I noted in that article for Areo Magazine, I noted on the sex network that had been constructed through social media, such as channels through Telegram, and the selling of sex slaves. I noted the Nadia Murad, which is, if you don't know who Nadia Murad is, she is the Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations for Iraq. She is an avid proponent for Yazidi rights and a human rights defender. Her lawyer famously is Amal Clooney, who's the wife of George Clooney. She is a hero to many, and I would say that she's also my personal hero as well. And I have been following her for quite some time, ever since she escaped Daesh's control. She lived under Daesh, I believe, 8 months. Just a reminder for those of you who don't know that this group, I should not have to remind people, but unfortunately I have to. This group is a tyrannical group, a very religiously fundamentalist group that has so much blood on their hands that still the international community has yet to properly deal with these perpetrators of barbarism and genocide. And it is unfortunate, really, that many of these ISIS people responsible have not gone and been put on trial for their crimes. However, saying this, a lot of them have been killed as well by the coalition forces. So whether you like to think that is positive or negative, it's up to you. I view it as bittersweet. As someone who actually believes that these people actually have to be put on trial. That's what I believe, especially when it comes to mass genocide and crimes against humanity. The reason why I say this, and this sort of segues into the next element of myself, is my political views. I am, for all intents and purposes, a social liberal. That's to say that I am liberal on many domestic policies and social policies such as gay marriage, abortion, euthanasia, you name it. I tend to be open to the idea that people, as long as they don't violate other people's rights, and as long as it's consensual and it doesn't infringe on liberties of any sort in terms of the law, this is of course the law is adhering to social liberal principles, or it does not impose upon minors or anything like that, then I usually am fine with it. I'm of the mind that as long as it's consensual, doesn't violate anyone's rights, and it's not with a minor of any sort, and I mean minor below the age of 18, of course, then I believe it's fine, usually. So I'm a social liberal. I tend to be for big government in the sense that I believe that the government needs to play a more active role in terms of putting money and investment into public policy. So not public policy, putting it into social welfare, healthcare. So I'm more of a, you could call me, I tend to lean towards, if anyone knows anything about Australian politics, I tend to lean towards Paul Keating and Bob Hawke when it comes to domestic policy, mainly on the right of people to have healthcare, the right of people to have be financially secure, and therefore to be a welfare of some sort, like a protection net for people. I believe that the government's role should be to help people out of poverty that benefits the majority of society. And I guess I depart somewhat from other libertarians, I should say I depart from libertarians by saying that I do believe that the government should help and intervene, especially when people are suffering in society at large. That's why I believe that when you come to things like homelessness, the government should be providing a safety net to help those people out of homelessness, to get them up on their feet. Not to give them everything necessarily, but to help them get a start. That's sort of my opinion, really. On economics, I tend to be de facto, I guess you could say, I would say Keynesian to neo-Keynesian. So I believe in government intervention in the economy, as long as it benefits the whole of society. That's to say, if the banks are squandering money, the government should put heavier regulations on those banks, and also should regulate what corporations especially do to the environment and to the exploitation of people. And I guess that does put me on the left. Well, I guess puts me on the left a bit. I tend to be somewhat center-left. However, what really distinguishes me from other, I guess, progressives in that sense is that my foreign policy tends to lean towards the right. I do believe in intervention and humanitarian intervention. So I believe that we have a moral obligation to intervene when the moment demands, to take the side of the victim, to aid them in their struggle, as to quote Hitchens. What do I mean by this is that governments should do their best to promote multilateralism in the form of international cooperation on human rights and adherence to the liberal world order, where we're trying to maintain the liberal world order. What do I mean by liberal world? What do I mean by the liberal world order? I mean securing those institutions and those rights that protect people and that protect the constitutions of many nations. I also believe in maintaining dialogue. However, when dialogue is exhausted, there should be action, especially when it comes to tyrannical governments. When you have tyrannical governments who violate the rights of their own people, they cannot hide behind the defense of sovereignty. I sincerely believe that when they violate the rights of their own people, their human rights, other governments should hold them accountable and act to defend those facing grave injustices. So what does that mean in practice? It means essentially being tough towards tyrannical dictatorships, to be able to, if not pressure these regimes into reform, such as is in the case of Saudi Arabia, with reform internally by external pressures such as the United States. If it's not through pressure through reform, then it should be through a cooperation with local dissenters within that state, as well as if this is always the last resort, and if all other matters do not work, then there should be some form of military intervention on the side of defending citizens of that state and civil society. What does that mean? That means, of course, should the moment demand, forces, whether it be the United States or other such countries, should do what they can to send in peacekeeping forces, security forces, to defend civilians from grave injustices, whether this be the bombing from state government or the mass genocide from a state government, such as in the case of Kosovo and other such areas as well. I believe this is necessary because, unfortunately, we live in a world where you cannot actually negotiate with tyranny, unfortunately. And no matter how hard we try, tyrants don't tend to like negotiations, unless it's in their favor, of course. We need only look to the old examples of Hitler and his expansion, first from Austria to Czechoslovakia and then finally into Poland, which of course sparked the Second World War. This came after repeated negotiation by Neville Chamberlain, as well as other League of Nations members, to try halt the expansion of Nazi Germany, which of course failed. It only meant the policy was really to buy time, I guess, for other states to prepare for the inevitable. But my thoughts on this matter is that we cannot be a spectator to tyranny. Now, of course, this is always easier to say in theory than it is to practice, and I understand there are many complex situations that do demand much more than just simple rhetoric on this matter. But I am a firm believer that that governments who can act should act. Maybe not in form of military, but maybe in the form of pressures through other means, or support of the people through other means. Okay. So that's my spiel on foreign policy. So you would call me I would say a liberal internationalist. That's what I would coin myself as when it comes to foreign policy. So if I had to recap, I'm socially liberal on the domestic front. I am neo-Keynesian to Keynesian. I would say more Keynesian on economic matters. That means I believe in government intervention into the economy. I would say I am just a liberal, or you could say somewhat a progressive liberal, on just other matters in terms of whether it comes to making sure that civil liberties are protected and to make sure that the law and justice are maintained. Sorry about that. That's my phone that just went off. And finally, of course, I'm a liberal internationalist when it comes to foreign policy. So that's what I am when it comes to my political and foreign policy views. Now, on the topic of things that I actually do discuss in terms of my pieces, and to segue back into a discussion on what I've written in the last couple of years, I should say that I've been focusing on the Syrian conflict since 2014, through, of course, the Rojava revolution. That's sort of my angle, has been always through the lens of minority rights. And this, of course, has led me to the wider Syrian conflict. For all those of you who are unaware of what's happening in Syria, it can be simplified as this. There is a dictator by the name of Bashar al-Assad. He has ruled the country ever since 2000. He rules in a dynasty under, you could say, Assadism, or it's a type of Baathism, or type of Pan-Arabism. It's an ideology that is Arab nationalist, very anti-Zionist, and quite, you could say, de facto National Socialist-esque in terms of its government structure. So what does that mean? So basically you have a dictator in charge, the military bows down to this dictator, and this whole security apparatus is maintained to secure this dictator's power. Now, back in 2011, 2012, mostly 2011, there were, I think 2010, 2011, there was protests against the Assad regime. These protests were met with violence, sparking off a civil war. Ever since then, the Assad regime has been launching a total war against the civilian population, as well as the opposition, which are labeled terrorists. So this is a very simplified view of the Syrian conflict. It really just gives you the nuts and bolts of what it is. Doesn't really tell you the dynamics of the conflict. But where I come in is that I've been following the Rojava revolution, which is, of course, one revolution within the whole Syrian political dynamic. It's very different from, I guess you could say, the wider Syrian revolution that happened in Idlib and other places as well. It more focuses on democratic confederalism, which is a ideology developed by Abdullah Öcalan, former PKK member or Kurdistan Workers' Party member. He's currently in jail at the moment in Turkey, in Imrali. You could say it's a combination of Murray Bookchan and other such libertarian socialist writers. It focuses on decentralization. It focuses on women's rights or genealogy. That's sort of like it's Kurdish feminism. It focuses on more cooperation as well as local civil council power, autonomy. Basically, what you're dealing with is that you have a system where there's Muncha civil councils, okay? Slow Kurdi wallet, I'm just at the moment just speaking, so sorry if I'm not responding too much to the chat yet. I've just got to explain this point because I'm explaining who I am and what I do. Okay, anyway. So if you can imagine the system, it's based on, you have civil councils and military councils. These civil councils operate throughout the northeast of Syria, or Rojava Kurdistan, which is western Kurdistan. They operate with the capital of Ain Issa and another political capital in Kamishli. Now, these councils work, I guess you could say, interdependent of one another, whereby a civil council, we'll give the example of the Raqqa Civil Council, because that's the one I always go to. The Raqqa Civil Council was set up after Operation Wrath of Euphrates in 2016, 2017, after the liberation of Raqqa by the Syrian Democratic Forces, who had liberated from Daesh, essentially. They set up a civil council made up of a co-head and co-woman. So co-woman and co-man, both of them are co-heads. One's Kurdish, one's Arab. The Raqqa Civil Council is the civil administration body for the Raqqa city. They, of course, I like Kurds. They, of course, are rebuilding Raqqa and are helping administer the city. The defense forces for the Raqqa Civil Council are the Raqqa Security Forces. They are the de facto military forces of the city. So that's how it works with many cities across Rojava, is that you have all these interdependent civil councils and military councils that provide self-defense, operating under this banner of democratic and federalism. It's very, as I said, the reason why I say it's decentralized mostly is because each of these communities, if you take, for example, Tel Tamr with the Sirak Military Council, that is a Syriac military force that operates in Tel Tamr, which is a predominantly Syriac community. It was formed during 2015, and it fights with other groups. I'll explain these dynamics a bit later, so don't get confused with these terminologies, but I'm just giving you an example of how the ideology operates. The Syriac Military Council, it operates as defense force for the Syriac Union Party and the Syriac community in Tel Tamr especially. So that's how it works. You have a civil council in Tel Tamr as well as a defense council that protect it. Now, these areas work under the Democratic and Federalist banner. And this ideology comes out of the Rojava Revolution, which started, of course, in 2012, for Kurds fighting against the Assad regime and for those seeking a third way. Because for the Kurds in Rojava, they viewed the Syrian National Coalition, the official de facto political body for, you could say, the Syrian opposition, main Syrian opposition, I should say, backed by Turkey. They viewed that organization as corrupt and becoming more and more Islamized, essentially. They viewed the Assad regime as a racist regime, mainly because it taught Arab nationalism. For example, in the 1971 constitution, or 1963 constitution of Syria, the only way you can be a citizen of Syria is if you're a Syrian Arab. They changed this, I think in 2011 or 2014, because they did give, in 2011 I believe, they did give Kurds in Hazaka citizenship. For a long time, Kurds in the northeast of Syria were considered as non-citizens or outsiders, if you will, or foreigners. They never held citizenship for a long time. This, of course, changed when Assad was trying to appease protesters. But on another matter is that the Assad regime, they viewed the Assad regime as a racist regime, an Arab nationalist regime. So the ideology of Rojava, as represented by a political coalition known as the Movement for Democratic Society, or TEVDEM, who is led by a big party called the Democratic Union Party, or the PYD. This party spearheaded TEVDEM, which, as I mentioned, is a political coalition made up of little parties such as the Syrian Union Party and other such parties, to create this model of democratic and federalism and apply it to areas that had been recently liberated from the Assad regime. Because there were multiple uprisings against the Assad regime in, of course, Afrin, Kobani, Kamishli, Hazaka, so on and so forth. There were multiple uprisings in the north. These people pushed out the Assad regime, and they created their own self-defense forces. And the self-defense forces that they created were, of course, the YPG, or the People's Protection Units. That's the main, predominantly Kurdish militia operating in the northeast of Syria. It helped liberate areas from the Assad regime and helped implement, along with TEVDEM's model, the democratic and federalist model in the areas recently liberated. So you had a civil council that would be set up along with the self-defense forces, usually made up of units from the local population. Okay, so that just to give you a long explanation. So I've been interested in those people for quite some time. But my love for Kurds, I would say, has existed since, I mentioned, 2013 onwards. I have been to Bashur, Kurdistan. I have been to the south of Kurdistan. I went there actually last year. I visited Holar, or Erbil. I visited Suleymaniye, or Suleymaniye, whatever you want to call it. I visited Duhok, Halabja, as well as Amedi, Accra, and Rwandes, Zarand, all these areas in the whole of you could say the south of Kurdistan, which all of those of you who don't understand this language, it's actually in the north of Iraq, but it's called southern Kurdistan. The Kurds call it southern Kurdistan because the majority of the population in the north are Kurdish, and they have been historically persecuted from the Arab majority, such as under Saddam Hussein's regime. In fact, during the late 1980s, and by the way, over here is a picture of me in, I think it's a Mehdi. That's me in a Mehdi. I visited the area in December of 2019. I'm forgetting my years over here. But I visited the country. The reason why I guess I have a passion for the Kurds is that for me, I see their struggle for statehood as a very important struggle. The struggle for many Kurds is the right to have a homeland. It's as simple as that, the right to exist, the right to have autonomy. For thousands of years, they've been persecuted by various different regimes and empires, whether it be the Ottoman Empire, or the Assad regime, or the Saddam Hussein regime, or even Ataturk, or any of these other dictators, or even Khomeini in Iran. These regimes have discriminated against the Kurds. For example, in Turkey, a lot of Kurds for a long time were considered mountain Turks. That was the language used to describe them. For a long time, Kurds were considered mountain Turks by the Turkish government, right up until the early 1990s. As well as in Iraq, they were gassed in 1980s during the Al-Anfal campaign, which is a campaign where Saddam Hussein used weapons of mass destruction, notably sarin gas, to gas Kurds, okay? Which was a tragedy. It killed thousands of Kurds, okay? Thousands of Kurds died. And after that, Kurds actually launched an uprising against Saddam Hussein, and only due to the assistance of the United States and the United Kingdom with Operation Northern Watch, a no-fly zone was established in the north of that state, and that's when the Kurdish regional government was able to arise, with its capital being in Erbil. For a long time, the Kurds have sought a form of statehood, whether it be through the uprisings in Arafat or Dersim, to those of the Republic of Mahabad, or Kurdistan Mahabad, in what's now Iran, or we call it Rosh Helet. The Kurds have fought for a long time for such a state. And what distinguishes them, I guess, from other ethnic groups is their ability to, and by the way, this is again with all ethnic groups, you're not going to have homogeneity with these things. You're not going to have one particular ideology for each Kurds. I mean, Kurds differ when it comes to politics, especially. You'll have Apuchis, nationalists, internationalists, so on and so forth. But what many Kurds agree on is that they first identify with their ethnicity. So when you ask a Kurd that I asked in southern Kurdistan what he is, he would say that he's Kurdish before Muslim, for example. Even though most Kurds are Sunni Muslim, a lot of them identify first with their ethnicity. They are proud to be Kurdish. Iraq is their national anthem, essentially. I would say I did fall in love with the place after reading about it and actually going to it. I have since helped support the Kurds, especially those in Rojava and Bashur, as well as Rosh Helet and Bakur. I support their struggle for autonomy, and I believe that they have the same rights, should have the same rights as other citizens. Unfortunately, for a long time they were not given the same rights, and even in Turkey, to some extent, there still is not enough civil rights for Kurds in the country. Kurdish people, I believe, consist 15% of Turkey's population, yet they don't acknowledge Kurdish or Kurmanji as an official second language in the country, or don't even acknowledge proper civil rights for Kurds in the country, in the constitution even. Because remember, for Turkey, there's only one nation, one language, one people. There's no Kurds or anything like that. It's this Turco nationalism that is embedded in the state structure. In Syria, they have not been acknowledged any form of autonomous status. Even as I mentioned before, the Assad regime is a very Arab nationalist regime. They believe in the notion that that to be Syrian is to be Arab. You have to be a Syrian Arab. And I remember that there was a census done in 1964 where thousands of Kurds essentially were stripped of any form of rights and denied the right to stay in Syria. Some of them were also, many of them I should say, were Arabized through the belt in the Hazaka area in the northeast of the country. Very tragic story. In Iran, of course, the Kurds overthrew the Shah of Iran, but were also betrayed by Khomeini, and Khomeini killed many officials, like of the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran. Many officials like Dr. Gassemlo, I think that's how you pronounce his name. They killed many officials, and Kurds are one of the biggest minority in the country that is hung for crimes against the state. A lot of Kurds are hung, especially for acknowledging that they are Kurdish, or to be acknowledged that they have a right to exist in the country. The only place where Kurds have some form of autonomous status would have to be in Iraq. Or even there, I don't want to say, I say this as just a sort of impartial kind of individual when it comes to the language. The Kurds have autonomy under the Iraqi constitution, and that's only since 2004, after the Americans invaded and kicked out Saddam Hussein. But prior to that, Saddam Hussein, like other Arab nations, as his Arab, you could say, neighbor, the Assad regime, he discriminated against the Kurds. I mean, as I mentioned, I told you about Al Anfal campaign, where thousands of Kurds were killed by sarin gas, mustard gas. And if you go, by the way, for all of those of you who have not gone yet, you should go to southern Kurdistan, essentially, which is, of course, in the north of, well, I wouldn't say the north of Iraq, but because I don't want to use the language of the north of Iraq, it's southern Kurdistan. If you go to Halabja, there's a monument there that's dedicated to the thousands of Kurds who lost their lives to those gas attacks. You can even find film footage as well. I've been to the monument. I've been to where the tanks and the aircraft that is by in Halabja area is. I've been there, and I must say that it is moving, especially. It is incredibly moving for just Kurds in general, but also for me myself, because you actually see in a place where mass slaughter of people occurred. Thousands of people, including children, especially children coming from school, were killed violently, suffocating on gas, poisoned sarin and mustard gas. It's horrific. It's frankly horrific. And one of the reasons why I guess I support the struggle for the Kurds is because I want to see them have a homeland for themselves. Really, that's what I'm supporting many Kurds. I don't have any, I guess I do have some biases here and there. I do have sympathies towards Rojava, Kurdistan, but the thing about it is that I am not going to, I guess, die over my partisanship or any of that. I support Kurds I would say I support minority people, especially Kurds, and their right to exist. Their self-determination, in other words. I support the right to self-determination. And I believe that Kurds deserve a homeland, as that's the only place that they will be safe. Because these states, even in the current dynamics of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government, the Iraqi central government has been doing its best to try weaken the Kurdistan regional government's autonomous status. And I only believe that when the Kurdish people actually get a nation state where they can actually say this is our country, that there will be some form of progress for themselves. Because at the moment, Kurds have done a lot of dying for a lot of different people. They've done dying amongst themselves as well as tyrants around them. And I do believe that Kurds will one day have their state, especially in my lifetime. I remember having a discussion with my friend Edja Mames. He's a Sydney Kurd. He comes from Bakur. He fled the country long time ago, probably in the 80s. Yeah, he even remembers telling me the stories of persecution against Kurds in Turkey, especially during those 80s and 90s days after the coup in the 1980 and subsequent years. And I must say to you that from his stories and what I've learned from him and from listening to him and other Kurds like him, is that these people have been dealt an extremely violent hand from history, and that there are regimes out there who want to destroy them. That's that simple, basically. Who have wanted to destroy them, essentially. And I must say that it's something that I just it still gets to me now. But besides that, I have to actually, I don't know how really what else to say. I think I'll just mention also that I also have looked at Saudi women's rights issues. I have also written on Iraq dynamics as well. I have a piece that should be coming out next week, actually, on Iraq. I've written on Syrian conflict in general as well. It's not just that's not my whole focus, the Kurds, but it is a big part of my life. I do that out of passion, really. Most of the pieces I write, I don't get paid for. I actually send them out to the various online syndications, and I wait for, hopefully, them to accept them. I don't get money for doing this. I really don't actually get anything for writing or even talking about this issue. It's just I'm passionate about it. And I want to return to this region because I guess you could say Kurdistan is a part of my heart, to put it bluntly. And I do have, and I've met a lot of good people, a lot of inspiring people from that region. And I honestly want to see them prosper, and I want to see Kurdistan become something of a nation one day. Whatever form it takes, I do wish the Kurds right and well. I just want to also mention, when it comes to these images that are showing up, these images are from our slideshow. For those of you who don't know, most of these images come from Rodi Said and a bunch of other Middle Eastern photographers. These are all the images I've collected in my portfolio. Some of them include old images of Rojava. Others include, of course, as you can see over here, Erdogan and Putin discussing Idlib dynamics. I'll do plenty more videos in the future, actually, on different aspects of the Syrian conflict, because that's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I've really wanted to... This video is more of an introduction into myself and a more generalized... You can see there's no one specific focus when it comes to this video. It's just mainly about telling people who I am, what I do, and where you can find me, and also answering some questions on the side of the chat as well, which I shall do quickly in about probably 5 minutes. Now, I've contributed to the region as well, the region being a predominantly left-wing, now defunct, unfortunately, online syndication dedicated for news, mostly about the Middle East and the Levant, really, the Levant area and Mesopotamia and Levant. So mostly Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, primarily. Those are the areas that focused on. I mostly wrote on, as I said, Rojava. I wrote on the Syrian conflict, especially... Sorry about that, I'm just taking a drink of water. I wrote on the Operation Olive Branch, which, for those of you who don't know, it was the annexation of Afrin by Turkish-backed Islamists of the Turkish army and Turkish auxiliary forces of the Turkish Free Syrian Army in 2018. And of course, the ethnic cleansing that happened after that. I also wrote on just the Syrian Democratic Forces in general. I wrote a number of... the thing about it is that I've written a lot of other different pieces as well in terms of the Syrian conflict. For the Jerusalem Post, I started contributing since 2019, and that's where I'm still contributing to this day. I've written on Iraq, on the defense of Rojava, on... I'm thinking what else I've of Yazidi rights as well. I've actually written a couple pieces on Yazidi rights now. Come to think about it, Yazidi rights, on trying to, I guess, repatriation of ISIS volunteers and the necessity of putting them on trial, I think, which is one of the pieces I've written for the Jerusalem Post. For those of you who want to try to find my pieces, I have them on my website, and I've linked my website and a number of other links in the, you could say, the About page. When you look at the About area, you can see the different links. Oh shit, okay, that's... sorry for the swearing. I kind of have missed out some pieces of stuff. But anyway, that's not good. Yeah, but anyway, I'll correct that About area, and I'll actually link my pages. But I have a website called philosophyismagic.com. That's my website. I just archive my my articles that I've done in the past. I'm still updating it, so I'm still trying to upload all my older articles, because I've written since 2016. I've only got stuff right up until 2017, I think. So I've got to actually do more. I've got to upload more, I guess, to the site. My Twitter is at Stoic Viper, or at capital S, lowercase TOIC, capital VIPER. So it's at Stoic Viper. You can find me also. I write for the Jerusalem Post, Areo Magazine, in the region. So my full name is Anthony Avice Du Buisson. So it's ANTHONY space AVICE space DU space BUISSON. And of course, if you just type that into Google, then you say comma Areo Magazine, or comma the region, or comma the Jerusalem Post, you'll find my essays that I've written for those various online syndications, which I have voluntarily given, I guess, to that, given for publication from those sites. Okay, I think that's all I've wanted to talk about. Now I want to actually address the chat. So if all of you are there, I guess, come type. I'm just going to come type in the chat. Monster Chris. Hold on a second. Okay. Come join. Okay. Questions. Okay. Now I guess I can actually get to the questions now. So for those of you who have actually bothered to watch, I guess, me spiel for the last hour, which is actually quite good. We're keeping time. I don't want to go too long. I just want to make this an hour and a half. So I guess it's much more succinct, and you can gather the gist of it, really. So Yep. Okay, so just to address some of Keaton Khan's comments in the chat. One of the comments I'll try in the future. I'll try to highlight some of these comments to put on screen. But for the moment, I'm a bit a noob, if you will, to streaming at the moment on my own channel. But okay. So good to know where you've been in this period. Couldn't you have posted short videos linking to the other things you appear on to help people find you? I could do that in the future, but as I said before, I've been busy with university work, because I also study a Bachelor of Laws with a Bachelor of Arts, the major in Politics and International Relations. And I'm quite busy as well, so I write in my free time. I'm not really much of a YouTuber per se. I have made videos in the past, as you can see in my channel, but it's not my bread and butter. So this is not my my go-to area. I mean, I'm very poor when it comes to editing, and I'm still working on many things. But I'll definitely take that into consideration. I wonder how men would benefit from ending the male guardianship system. I don't think that's a serious question, but if it were a serious question, I would just say that the male guardianship system, it's not really like a legal system. Like, it's not like a codified legal system in Saudi Arabia. It's more of a combination of law, customs, and laws. So some of these have to do with restrictions on women's movement. It used to be the ban on women driving. Of course, that was lifted in 2017. And it's just also about the cultural practices as well of the society at large. What it means by ending male guardianship system, it's mainly ending the customs and strict laws around that, I guess you could say, institutionalize misogyny against women, especially in Saudi Arabia. Because it supports, I guess you could say, male toxicity. Oh, sorry, is that toxic masculinity? I think that's the proper term for it. I don't like using those terms, but I'm trying now to extract old terms from my brain. But anyway, like concepts like toxic masculinity for males, where it actually, males in Saudi Arabia treat women as quote unquote princesses. Where what I mean by that is more like, okay, you cover up, you're my property, I lead you, you don't lead yourself. That's sort of the attitude, like where beatings are accepted. I mean, I've heard stories, and one of the pieces actually I wrote on male guardianship called A Kingdom of Tears back in 2016 for Areo Magazine. I mentioned the story of Aisha, but I've also heard other stories from various people. I can't really name names, but let's just say that there's quite some violent stories where violence is essentially normalized towards women, especially domestic violence. And it just really, the whole male guardianship system is bad, not only for women but also for men, because it supports this wrong ideology that of misogyny, and it supports this ideology of, you could say, male superiority towards women, and essentially it sort of teaches the young men especially how to treat women, which is negatively usually. I know that Mohammed bin Salman, who's the Prince of Saudi Arabia, is reforming the country slowly, and I do actually applaud him for that, although I am very cautious as to his reforms, and I do think that more can be done, and hopefully more will be done, because a lot of Saudi women do want to leave the country, but just because of their families or because of the laws of this society, it's very hard for them to do. Okay, so what's next? By the way, I'm getting to comments slowly, so just keep typing away. I'll respond to things. Not responded. Okay. Yeah, we did actually deal. So Keaton Kun says that I thought we had already dealt with ISIS. We actually did. We destroyed their territorial proto-state in 2017. Actually, Haider al-Abadi announced in December 2017 victory over ISIS, at least Iraqi victory over ISIS's territorial proto-state. The coalition under the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the main U.S. Central Command operation that is with over 60-plus states to get rid of or to annihilate Daesh, in partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces, Iraqi security forces, and Peshmerga. These forces had destroyed over 98% of the caliphate by early 2017. And the last areas of control, of course, were in Mosul, Raqqa, and then, of course, the very last area in 2019 was in, you could say, the Hazaka pocket, and in the south of Hazaka near Deir Zur. So we have destroyed the territorial proto-state of ISIS. However, ISIS has turned into a low-key insurgency, where they still operate in the Anbar and Kirkuk provinces, especially in the north of Kirkuk. Actually, one of the reasons, unfortunately, when the Hashd al-Shabi, which is a Shia coalition of IRGC or Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps paramilitaries, entered in Kirkuk after the withdrawal of Peshmerga in 2017 following the Kurdish referendum, a lot of violence and instability resurged in the Kirkuk province due to Iraqi government, you could just plainly say incompetency and corruption, as well as poor management of the area. So ISIS has resurged in the Anbar and Kirkuk provinces. That's why the United States still has forces there, about 5,200 forces, I believe, as the coalition spokesperson has told me a couple of weeks ago. Actually, one of the team did, but anyway. So yeah, we still have a lot to do. We haven't destroyed the ideology yet either, and there's still hundreds of Yazidis still missing, and there's not been a proper, I guess, repatriation of ISIS volunteers to the foreign states that they've come from. The primary reason is because a lot of these foreign states simply don't want to try them on the soil. They want to sort of outsource their justice system to these, you could say, authoritarian-esque states like Syria and Iraq, because, as you know, in Iraq, the punishment for fighting with ISIS or joining ISIS or even you could say collaborating with Daesh is, of course, death by hanging or death being shot, either way. In Syria, it's pretty much the same, although I would say that the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, more uses Daesh prisoners as a means to undermine the opposition. But that's another story for another time, which I will explore in a different video. But other than that, I would also have to say that the ideology is yet to be completely annihilated as well. And the long-term defeat of Daesh is still very much in progress, so there's very much to do. So Kurdi Wallet said Slaw, which is hello in Sorani. And I say, by the way, Salam Kurdin, Achoni, or if you're Kramanji, it's Chawa. Basically, how are you, Mr. Kurdi Wallet? I do like Kurdistan. I mean, I did a whole section just talking about Kurdistan, which you probably have already listened to. Okay, it's good to see. By the way, hello Maximus the Great. I did a stream basically, and this is just the introduction to who I am. You're free to ask questions. So just get into Kutun Khan's comments. If you think Kurds should have an ethnic homeland, do you think other ethnic groups should have ethno-states? I get where you're getting at. Sorry, I get your point, Kitun Khan. I guess just like the Jews got their homeland with the State of Israel, I believe Kurds should get their homeland as well, because at the moment they're being discriminated by various other regimes. Should it be a Kurdish national, like a Kurdish, you could say just a wholly Kurdish ethno-state? I would say not really. Just the same way that Israel is technically not a Jewish supremacist state, it's more of a pluralistic democracy. Kurdistan should be the exact same, a pluralistic democracy. Yeah, except this time, of course, where Kurdish rights are defended and Kurdish culture can actually also be defended as well. What I'm saying is that the Kurds just need a homeland so they can actually live and have the rights that they deserve, so they can practice their culture and customs. If that means that they can practice it with Assyrians or Arabs or so on, then so be it. That I'm fine with that. Just as Palestinians can have rights in, you could say, Israel, and still, you can have Arabs on administration and so on, so too I believe that non-Kurds should also have a place in this Kurdish or Kurdistan in the future. Yeah. Okay. I didn't know how to say that in a non-productive way. What is the difference between ethnic states for minorities like Kurds and other groups, if any exist? Is that they are unsafe elsewhere? Okay, so ethno-states, primarily states such as, let's give an example of Syria. Syria is by default an Arab supremacist state. Why? Because for a long time the constitution acknowledged that to be Syrian was to be Arab. That was in its constitution, and that non-Arabs would not be acknowledged as part of the citizenry. It's the same in Turkey to some extent. There's some Turkish supremacism going on, where there's one language, one nation, one people. That's the Turks. It's that kind of notion of identity. Those ethno-states I deplore because they discriminate against minorities. They actually put one ethnic group above other groups. Okay. Now, this would be fine if it was equal with other groups. So, for example, you had Syriac and Kurdish rights being protected under the Syrian constitution along with Arab rights, and it was more of a multicultural state. So, one suggestion that the Democratic Union Party actually posed a Russian delegation in 2015 met with the Assad regime on behalf of the PYD, because the PYD have their own office in Moscow. It's one of their own political offices. They also have one in Washington. But the Democratic Union Party, they proposed the notion of changing the name of the Syrian Arab Republic to the Syrian Democratic Republic. So in other words, making a more multi-ethnic state like it used to prior to of course, the Ba'ath coups in the 1970. 1960s, 1970. That's what they proposed. However, the Assad regime rejected it, because again, the Assad regime is very fanatical. It wants an Arab-only state. That it wants an Arab ethno-state. Now, what I want, as I mentioned before, when it comes to Kurdistan, is I want to make sure that the Kurds have their homeland, they can practice their culture, while as it's in equilibrium with other cultures as well, other societies. So whether it be Assyrians, Chaldeans, so on and so forth. In other words, there's an equal playing field for many of the different groups, but also just acknowledging their national anthem and their culture, really. So yeah, and I know it's may seem paradoxical, admittedly, but that's, I guess, how I rationalize it, I guess. It's a bit behind when I posted the question about men benefiting from male gunshots was kind of serious. I read a paper highlighting how the Saudi system hurts men as well as women earlier. Yep, I understand where you're getting at, but I think even Salman is constrained in what he can do. His recent reforms got a lot of pushback, I hear. When it comes to the Saudi system, especially when it comes to men and women, how they're treated, I do understand your point that men are supposed to fulfill a role as the male guardian and sort of almost like a burden to them. That wouldn't be a burden to them, but it mustn't be mistaken that men are not the heaviest hit by the male guardianship laws. It's of course females, because they are completely without autonomy. They are stripped of their autonomy actually as well. So that must be acknowledged, and I do get where you're coming from, although I have to say that, when it comes to severity of who's getting the shit end of the stick, to put it that way, I would have to say it will always come down to Saudi women, basically, who are getting the poor end of the stick. Highlighting how this earlier system hurts men as well as women. Yep. Even Salman is constrained in what he can do. His recent reforms. Yeah, Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince of Saudi Arabia. Yeah, there we go. We have at least an appropriate slide this time around for what I'm talking about. He's pushed these reforms, notably because he's a young individual. He's also been pressured by the West, because the West has been pressuring Saudi Arabia for quite some time, because ever since the JCPOA, or let's just say the Iranian nuclear deal, that Saudi Arabia has felt a bit insecure at whether or not the United States will stay on their side as an ally. This is part of the reason why Saudi Arabia has repaired bilateral relations with neighboring countries such as Israel, because it's tried now very much to be more shifting towards a more moderate kind of platform, more, you could say, Western happy, you could say Western beneficial position, where they can still get, because Saudi Arabia is a rentier state, for those of you who know international relations, and that a rentier state is a state that depends wholly for most of its economic revenue on external entities such as companies. So most of Saudi Arabia's wealth comes from its oil. That's why various oil companies are in the country. It's also head of OPEC, largest oil multilateral organization. So we just have to remember that Saudi Arabia is very dependent on their oil sales. Their rentier state, in other words. And because of that, Saudi Arabia cannot afford to lose not only its alliance with the United States, which is very important to its position against Iran when it comes to that Cold War-esque battlefield that Saudi Arabia is heading against when it comes to facing Iran, but also to ensure that its power is maintained and its economy keeps running in Saudi Arabia. So these are one of the reasons why these reforms also come from King Abdullah II through the 2030 vision as well. These are all to really modernize the Saudi state and bring it into the 21st century. That means to be a bit more socially reformed, as well as to be more politically and economically reformed. Well, not, I would say politically reformed as well. Will it turn into the next I guess Tunisia. I don't think so. I don't think we'll have a chance in hell of doing that in the next 100 years. But I do think it's heading more towards Kuwait, like in terms of its Kuwait and the UAE, in terms of its shift towards how its governments act. So it's becoming less, I guess, authoritarian. But that's going to take a long time still. Yeah. Do we have any more questions, please? I'm going to try see if any more people are going to come ask a question. Okay, I have a bunch of other questions as well that people have asked me on my Twitter, actually, and I shall be answering those as well. If you want to type anything in the chat, please do. If you're still listening, I'm going to be trying to answer some more questions. I'll be answering some questions that I have on Twitter. I have one question from Global Affairs, or Anthony Roberto. He says, explain the protests inside Idlib city. For all of those of you who don't know, there has been recent protests against Turkish and Russian troops in Idlib at the moment, as well as protests against various militias there. For those of you who also don't know the wider dynamics, I won't explain them in detail because this is not the point of the video. What you just got to know is that Hatal al-Sham, along with a lot of other Islamist factions, currently dominate Idlib province. And they are backed, of course, not the HDS, I should say the Syrian National Army, which is the Turkish auxiliary, is backed by Turkey in the area. And recently Turkey and Russia signed a ceasefire in, I believe, March or April. And this ceasefire was over an offensive in Idlib that had been pushed by the UAE and other countries for Assad to sort of take the last area of Idlib province in the northwest of the country. These protests really come as a result, I would say, from just the despotism from the gangs that rule Idlib province at the moment, as well as, you could say, the Assad regime's offensive. So a lot of people are protesting the administration, and they're not happy with Turkey or Russia for that matter, because a lot of people feel that Turkey has betrayed the revolution, and they feel a lot of these parties have betrayed the revolution as well. And I can't blame them. The revolution has turned sour, to put it lightly. So that's that question. How do we deal with Tayyip Erdogan? So this is from Jay Turner of the War Kettle. By the way, if you ever want to follow anyone that's basically someone who's interested in Cyprus and Cypriot affairs, please follow the War Kettle or Jay Turner. And he asks me, as I repeat again, how do we deal with Tayyip Erdogan? That's a very broad question, and it does have it's very multifaceted the way the one could answer this. But I think he means, how do we deal with Recep Tayyip Erdogan's quasi-expansionism and authoritarianism across the Middle East? I would say that we have to treat Recep Tayyip Erdogan's regime for what it is, that it is an autocratic regime led by one dominant party, the AKP, that has locked thousands of people away in jails on the trumped-up charges of terrorism. We need to start putting sanctions on the country. We need to pressure Turkey to reform in terms of how it treats its Kurdish population. We need to push for a solution, a peaceful political settlement between the PKK and the Turkish state. That's one element. The second element, we need to push for democratic reforms in the country. We also need to contain Turkey's jingoistic policies when it comes to Syria and Iraq. We need to make sure that we have a mechanism by which we can suspend and expel states when it comes to NATO, because Turkey is a very important member of NATO because it has access to the senior Russia. I can't for the life of me remember the name now. I don't have it on my thing. I think it's the Baltic Sea, if I'm correct. Probably I'm not correct on that, but anyway, don't quote me on that. But anyway, or the Black Sea, I can't remember, one of the two. It has access to those areas. It's also the gateway to Europe. It also has control of a huge migrant flow into Europe. Sorry, just having a water break. But anyway, yeah, I understand why it's an important NATO member. However, I do think that it's not acting as it should when it comes to NATO's principles of defending peace and security as well as democracy abroad. And I think that we need to put pressure on Turkey to democratically reform and to change, especially. So that's my thoughts on how we can deal with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So at the moment, this guy is sort of I would say, the second most influential leader since Ataturk for Turkey. That's what he's sort of made himself to be. And he's not going to go away anytime soon. Okay. The last question I've got on my Twitter is... hold on one second. Okay. Sorry for people who are listening. I just want to ask some of my Twitter questions. This comes from Pes, who, by the way, for those who don't know, Pes is Maximus the Great. This comes from Pes, and he says, will the Muslim Brotherhood be making resurgence anytime soon, particularly in Egypt? For those of you who don't know, Egypt was the victim of a Muslim Brotherhood-led government under Mohammed Morsi in 2013, after, of course, the Egyptian Revolution in Tahrir Square. And that, of course, that led to elections that deposed former President Hosni Mubarak. Elections elected Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. Mohammed Morsi actually cracked down on democratic protests against his government, and he actually was trying to make the state into an Islamic emirate by changing the constitution. He was removed by General al-Sisi's coup, you could say. In the subsequent year, Mohammed Morsi, of course, died in prison, and Sisi has since led the country. Sisi is, by all intents and purposes, a Mubarak 2.0. He is exactly as Mubarak was. And to understand really the problem with the Muslim Brotherhood is that the Muslim Brotherhood has its origins with people like Sayyid Qutb in the 1950s. They've always been a problem, 1930s I should say. They've always been a problem for Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, they are quite fundamentalist, they're Islamist. They used democracy as a vehicle to actually gain about an Islamic emirate. I also have to mention that Erdogan's and most of the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey is called Ikwan. I think it's Ikwan or Ikvan. That's also Turkish Muslim Brotherhood. Whether it makes a resurgence in Egypt could be quite possible, because a lot of political prisoners in Egypt are Muslim Brotherhood members. Actually, a lot of Egyptian prisoners are full of Muslim Brotherhood members. Why? Because the Muslim Brotherhood has a network there. Has a very strong network in that area. And it operates throughout the Middle East. It has its own political bodies in America, for example, like with CAIR or CARE, which is a front for the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as it's a banned terrorist organization in Egypt, to say the least. It's also banned from other countries as well. One of its mouthpieces is Al Jazeera, or that's very controversial. People would say that Muslim Brotherhood is not really Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera is Qatari state media, but Al Jazeera acts as de facto mouthpiece for the Muslim Brotherhood. Essentially, a de facto mouthpiece for Sunni Arab Islamism. That's a bit of a controversial opinion, but yes. Okay. So, I'm going to see if I've got any questions in... I'm thinking of another one. Okay, I would see... I'm just trying to see... Okay, cool. I'm going to ask now I'm going to answer the questions now in the chat again. So sorry, I'll return to the chat now. So this is from Suzuki Nathi. It is, what is your opinion on the Rohingya situation in Myanmar, and would you support a military intervention? Very good question. Thank you for the question, Suzuki Nathi. I'm probably butchering that name, but then again, I butcher a lot of names on this podcast. I mean, my Kurdish is, you could say, basic bitch level, to put it sillily. But anyway, I would say that for those of you who don't know, that the Rohingya are a large ethnic group that reside in Bangladesh and Myanmar, it used to be called Burma, essentially. They're a huge population that has been discriminated by the military government at the moment. Now, the military government is launching a genocide against the Rohingya people, essentially expelling millions via force and killing thousands through the use of airstrikes, bombardments, and other mass violence. Would I support a military intervention? I would say yes, I would. I support a military intervention to oust the currently military junta and the currently military government. However, I would have to do it in coordination with other nations, so that's going to be a bit of trouble as well. Because the problem is that with any intervention, you've got to think about the long term as well. Currently, we know that the Rohingya people aren't benefiting from being genocided, to say the least. And we understand that the UN has tried to put proposals forward for safe zones, but unfortunately the UN has been toothless on this matter. I think, honestly, there needs to be a coordinated effort. This needs to go to the United Security Council. It needs to be spearheaded by the United States, potentially, or even France. I guess France could do it as well, or one of the other countries, where there has to be a resolution being put forward that says that, okay, we'll give the Myanmar government this time limit to cease and desist all activities, or else there will be an intervention or a campaign of bombing to bomb military positions of the Myanmar government. And like we did, for example, in Kosovo with Milosevic's government, when they were persecuting the ethnic minority over there. And this will have to then, if they don't adhere to these terms, what will happen is that I believe that whether it be the United Nations or most likely it will be probably NATO, does coordinated strikes against positions that the military are using in Myanmar against the Rohingya people. So destroying artillery centers, military facilities, and other such bases. You do then, of course, putting down forces to create some form of safe zone against those military forces and forcing the Myanmar government into a peace settlement or a political settlement with the Rohingya people. That's how you do it. You go back to the late 90s of that humanitarian interventionist attitude as promoted by Kofi Annan and other such leaders. You need to have that firm, strong response where you say to those tyrants that we will not tolerate this behavior, we will not tolerate mass genocide, we will not tolerate this continued genocide, we will use the NATO Air Force or even any, you could say, multilateral Air Force to target military facilities and military bases as well as military equipment being used against Rohingya people by the Myanmar government, and will pressure that government into a peace settlement or a political settlement with the Rohingya, where the Rohingya have their protected rights assured, and will maintain some form of monitoring body that can maintain that those measures are met. Okay, so that's my answer to Suzuki Nathi. I hope that answers your question. Okay, Maximus the Great, or Pes, has asked, what are the prospects for a possible fall of the Islamic Republic of Iran? Okay, that's a very interesting question. Probably people are waiting for me to say, for those of you who didn't know, but I'll just say that the Ayatollah regime has been in power for a long time, ever since late 1979. It has created a state, a fanatical state, that has expanded its tentacles, if you will, in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen through the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. It is currently destabilizing Iran. It's currently oppressing thousands of Iranian people. I think the prospects for a fall of the Islamic Republic of Iran is within our grasp. I think within the next couple of years, we shall see this regime fall. Why do I say so? Is because sanctions at the moment from the Trump administration are working currently. They're targeting rich business individuals and other individuals and forcing the regime into a desperate state, I would say. Because under the JCPOA, under Obama's JCPOA, which was the previous Iran nuclear deal, Iran was expanding its tentacles anyway within Syria and Yemen and Iraq, and was actually getting money from that deal through other means, such as through the foreign aid and through the lifting of sanctions. It's actually helped the Ayatollah regime quite greatly. And I think that though it was a mistake from the Obama administration's part, I understand why the Obama administration did that. Because at the end of the day, the whole point of the JCPOA was to bring Iran, the Ayatollah regime, to the negotiating table, to facilitate the wind down of nuclear production and nuclear arms production, and to put a watchdog on that nuclear arms production. However, I do think that the deal neglected other more important aspects, such as, of course, the expansion of Iranian influence. And I don't think it was actually helping in the wind down of nuclear production. I think, if anything, it made them go into secret, basically, when it comes to nuclear arms production. And I think that we need to still somehow make sure that the Iranian regime does not possess a nuclear weapon in the near future. And that will be a difficult task, but we can't do it through a deal that essentially empowers that regime and keeps them alive by giving them money that they are not even using for the proper means to help their people. I do think we need to support local dissent as well. I support, of course, the Kurdish groups in that area as well. I also support the Iranian people, especially the Iranian Republicans, who are seeking a republic away from the current Islamic Republic, one that's based more on democratic principles. Although there's a problem with that, is that there's no strong major party at the moment or organized bloc that is actually supporting that idea of creating a democratic, multi-ethnic Iran, or Persia, whatever you want to call it, whatever its name become eventually. So that is another issue that needs to be addressed and dealt with, especially. That will have to become a major issue in the future, I can see. Okay, Suzuki Nathi has asked, if when we were to take out the Assad regime, what sort of government would you want to replace it? I am very much in favor of replacing the Assad regime with a multi-ethnic, democratically elected government. This was an original proposal made by the Geneva Accords and the Astana process. However, the problem with those processes at the moment is that they are currently spearheaded by de facto corrupt Islamist parties, which will not or do not want a democratic transition, but instead want to use their democratic transition to transition it to Islamic Emirates or an Islamic Caliphate, which I think is unacceptable. Alternatively, the Movement for Democratic Society, or TEV-DEMS, Democratic Confederalist model, could be applied to Syria. However, given its Apuchi and you could say decentralized nature, it's already been rejected by the SNC and the Assad regime, because both don't want federalization of any sort. However, I do think that the best government that the best government that Syria can have would be one where you have a state that is federated. You have its different regions for different people. So, for example, in the case of Syria, you would have a federated region for the Kurds and Syriacs in the northeast. You would allow Rojava to exist. You would allow the Syrian Democratic Forces to be the de facto military force there. Okay? In the northwest, you could have your own northwestern opposition that would be federated. They would be led potentially by a locally elected official from Idlib and the surrounding area, also in Turkish-occupied areas, although I would say that Turkey needs to be expelled from Syria completely, but that's another matter. And what you would have is the title of the state be called Syrian Democratic Republic. You would have the constitution that acknowledged the rights of all minorities within Syria. You would ensure that the legal system is very appropriate for a democratic state and that can support civil society and criticism against the state. You put in a mechanism that can support democratic elections. You go through that process. So I would say part of the Geneva process, along with part of Tev Dem's process, along with my own opinion added in as well. So that's why I think that the future for the Syrian state after Assad should be. Although I don't know what's going to actually happen to it, but we'll see. Okay. Maximus the Grace asked, so what becomes of the current US-Iran policy of sanctions and containment if Biden becomes president? It's a good question. I am worried that Biden will return to Obama's policy regarding Iran. And for all those of you who are unfamiliar, Obama's vice president was Biden, and he, along with Kerry, spearheaded the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. As I mentioned prior, I don't believe that was a good deal. I believe, if anything, it empowered the Iranian regime, and I believe that returning to such a deal would actually give them a lifeline. It would actually alienate a lot of our Gulf members, countries like Saudi Arabia. Whatever you may think of Saudi Arabia, comparatively to Iran, it plays the ball when it comes to the West. It's one of the strongest allies that the United States has in the Middle East. It is reforming slowly, yes. It has a lot of things it needs to do, as I mentioned before. I want to play apologetics for its tyrannical acts in Yemen. But I do want to say that the Iranian regime is an expansionist regime. Okay? It's an expansionist regime that has a very anti-Israel focus as well as an sheer expansion vision for neighboring nations. If you look what it's doing in Iran, most of Assad's forces that are fighting for him are actually under the rule of the IRGC, or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And most of them are Iranian paramilitaries, most of them using children from other states such as Afghanistan, some as young as 13 even. This is a Shia fundamentalist state that wants to spread the revolution to neighboring Iraq as well, as it's doing in the Basra region. He wants to change the Iraq to a Shia-dominated state, despite, of course, the Sunni and Kurdish minorities in that country. It wants to change Syria into entirely an Axis-resistant state, where it could be used as a vehicle to get into Lebanon, and from Lebanon into Israel. That's the main aim of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Iranian regime, because they believe that the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia are hostile actors that are causing instability in the region. So it views it through the lens of realpolitik to contain these entities. It actually has containment. It has a containment policy for Israel, in other words. That's how Iran has its policy set out. So I don't know what would happen to Biden. I'm hoping that he would keep sanctions on, but however, I don't actually know what Biden would do. That's what worries me about Biden's foreign policy. I'm so worried that he'll just return to the Obama administration's status quo and actually reverse the sanctions and lift and create a new deal for Iran, which would empower the regime. Because there are a lot of Iranian, sympathizers in the U.S. government that would like to see the, White House become very friendly with the Iranian regime and very hostile towards Saudi Arabia. And if you had to put a gun to my head, which would I choose, Saudi Arabia or Iran, I would choose Saudi Arabia hands down, just based on my prior arguments. Please ask more questions. I'm going to see if there's any more questions being asked. I suppose that I'll let this run for about a good 20 more minutes. I suppose when it comes to these topics, what books I would recommend for people, it would be interesting if people would actually pick up books from historians and international scholars. If you want to know the political dynamics of Russia, for example, Vladimir van Wildenberg, he's a journalist friend of mine. He has co-authored a book on the Kurds of northern Syria, Politics, Governments, and War, I think it's called. that you can find. It's very well researched. It has a lot of peer review, academic sources. He's got also on the ground experience because he's been there for many years. He speaks the local language. He's been to Rojava and Bashur Kurdistan quite a lot. He's a very knowledgeable guy. I would recommend his work on the matter. I would recommend who's the other guy? 1 second, I just gotta look at the guy's name. Mr. Kurtz. Pardon me, just looking up a book. I would recommend David McDowell's A Modern History of the Kurds. It's a very extensive and very interesting look on the history of the Kurdish people throughout the many millennia and centuries, as well as contemporary history up until like 1976 and onwards. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, there was actually, for the life of me, I wish I had these books available right before me, so apologize again, but you can find many different journal articles at your, I would say if you want to do some proper research, follow local journalists, historians and scholars, as well as their writings. You can mostly find them probably on your, if you're at a university, you'll have a university search engine. Go look into their, type in the various names and look at scholarly and peer-reviewed articles, and you get started through there. I know I wish I had more on my plate at the moment, but I simply just don't have the books before me. I'm going on my memory here, because it took me a lot of research to actually do my essays. For the life of me, sometimes I forget their sources. I would say also for people, keep very cautious when it comes to information that you get. I always say this on other podcasts, but it should be a primary focus that you should be an active listener. If you're listening to this, whether it be now or in the future, please, for the life of you, please do your research. Do not believe things simply because someone on a nice microphone is telling you these things. Please don't be lazy. Please, I implore you. Sorry, I encourage you, sorry, to do your research, to think about these issues, and go on where the evidence leads you. Okay? I admit I have my own bias. Okay? As you notice, I have sympathies towards Rojava and Kurds in general, as well as sympathies towards, I guess, the West and NATO, essentially. Although I don't play apologetics for Turkey at times. I don't really like Turkey that much at the moment. But I tend to have a liberal internationalist leaning, social liberal leaning, neo-Keynesian leaning, that kind of leaning. So I recommend people please do your research. Think critically. Be an active listener when it comes to these podcasts, because I'm going to be doing another podcast probably next week. This was really an introduction. Introduction really to myself, what I do, where I write, who I am, what my beliefs are, and why I even care. A lot of the pictures, by the way, that you see on the screen, I'm repeating now probably for the fourth time. These pictures are taken by Rodi Syed and other photographers in the Middle East. Some of them don't particularly have an order. These are the pictures that I find striking and interesting. Some of them have Assad, some of them Erdogan, as you notice, some of them in the United States, some of them have Kurds, Saudi woman, whatever you want to have it. I put them on the screen because I find these pictures interesting. And it does cover a long, big genre. I'm going to create more slideshows when I do podcasts, and I'm going to try put the chat on the screen as well. I don't know how to do that yet, I'll be honest. So it'll be a bit of time before I actually get a hold of this stuff, okay? So I just wanted to say, I think I may wrap it up here at about 105 minutes. I just want to say to everyone who listened, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to sit down or work and do whatever and listen to me. And thank you for all those of you who are in the chat, who asked questions. I will be doing more of these streams in the future. I am, For those of you who are new to this channel in the future, who are listening to this in the future, my name is Anthony Avice Du Buisson. I'm an essayist. I am South African born. I currently live in Australia. I'm studying a Bachelor of Arts with a major in Politics and International Relations and a Bachelor of Laws at James Cook University. I am an essayist who focuses on the Middle East and North African region, focus on history, politics, philosophy, and minority rights, especially Kurdish rights. I have contributed for the Jerusalem Post, Areo Magazine, and The Region. You can find me at Stoic Viper on Twitter, so that is capital S, lowercase TOIC, capital V, lowercase IPER. And you can find my journal articles, which I will link them in the about, or sorry, the bio, or whatever, the description box below. Be sure to, if you haven't already subscribed to me, I know that this is sort of like, I don't really ask this kind of stuff, but if you want to, you can subscribe to me. I upload, I'll try to upload on a regular basis. And if you want to also try find me, you can also look up Superpower Broadcasting, which is a podcast that Kevin Castley hosts. I'm occasionally on that. Look up also Jay Turner's The War Kettle. I've been on a podcast for that recently. I talked about Chris Hitchens in depth. I've been on Progressive Warhawks, or Tips, if you know him, YouTube channel as well. I've talked about Kurds over the last 3 to 4 years on his channel, just a couple of podcasts. You can find me mostly on Twitter. I have a Twitch as well. I've recently got that. It's Anthony Avice Du Buisson, as the name suggests. I'm going to see what's happening with Twitch. I also go by the name of Stoic Viper on Twitch as well. My email is anthonyavicedubuisson@gmail.com. That's all lowercase, by the way. My website is Philosophy, the Stuff of Magic, or philosophyismagic.com. That's where you'll find my archived work. You can find me on Facebook at Philosophy, the Stuff of Magic. And I'll think about what else do I have to mention. That's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this. There'll be more streams, a bit more detail. And again, thank you, and good night, and stay safe.